pleased to be here. I'm Joe McGovern from Everything Health, and we're very pleased to be part sponsor of the conference with Nicholas Hall. You know, one of the things that I am grateful for is that I joined the pharmaceutical industry. At the time I was making career choices. It could have been the oil industry, could have been tobacco. They weren't seen as bad as they are now. But then I would have had Joe Gitchell after me, and that wouldn't have been good. But I decided to join the pharmaceutical industry, and that was fantastic because I felt we were launching products that save lives. I started in the pharmaceutical industry, and one of the things I learned in marketing is that products have life cycles. And one of the things I asked the R&D people early on is, what's the life cycle of a drug? And they said, well, you know, often the therapeutic life cycle of a drug is about 50 years. Some drugs last longer. Aspirin is over 100 years old. Paracetamol, acetaminophen, that's over 100 years old. Digitalis is 400 years old. So drugs have a very long life, but in practice, in marketing terms, they have a much shorter life because patents are 20 years and you have to do your development within the patent time. So you end up with 10, 11, 12 years to market the product, and then you get private label generics, and then your business goes. So it was one of my struggles as a general manager of a pharma business to launch products and then suddenly lose in 1 year a third of my business, and then have to build it up again and then lose it again. It was very difficult. And one of the things I was happy to see when I switched to the consumer healthcare business was that brands have much longer lives. And one way at GSK and then at Pfizer, we had teams that looked at what you do with drugs, prescription drugs, at the end of their lives. And there were about 10 strategies, but one of those was Rx-to-OTC switch. An Rx-to-OTC switch gives new life to a drug. The other thing it does for the OTC industry is gives it a pipeline. Now, a pipeline is very important because the OTC industry needs growth. And switch is critical for growth. It's a key driver of growth. And mostly, switch is a way of benefiting public health too, because it gives access to a greater number of people than would have got access to it on prescription. FDA agrees too. FDA says we need more switches. We need more switches for greater access. The other thing that's interesting in this industry is demand. One of the things that's been a background theme here and in other places is that the country and the world is getting more challenged by chronic risk factors. We heard a great deal about diabetes yesterday. We also, because of obesity, which we heard about yesterday, see a much greater incidence of heart disease. When we hear from Joe, we'll hear about the problems of smoking and cigarette smoking in the world. So the world is going to be crippled with chronic risk factors and chronic diseases to the extent that it will actually affect, and there's significant studies by Harvard on this, it will significantly affect the economic growth of the country, let alone the performance of people in employment and the actual cost of managing those chronic diseases. So we need, it's interesting now that we're in an industry that has an almost infinite amount of demand. If you look at other industries, they would love demand, and they would love demand to be growing. We're challenged with demand because we have demand, and we're challenged with satisfying that demand because you know, regulations get in front of that. So we're going to talk about Switch this morning. Switch has driven industry growth. The main brands in Switch, you can see that if you want to be in the top 20 drugs, you better have a switch because the non-switches are old drugs. They're drugs that were launched decades ago. So it's very, very hard to become a leading OTC unless you've come from prescription. Now let's look at some of the switches that have happened since 2020. Switches bring big sales suddenly to a company, but they also need continuous product improvement. You can see the switches there that have been around since the year 2000. All of those, incidentally, have private label competition. None of those have exclusivity. And it's interesting that if they were prescription drugs, they would hardly exist at all, because the system with prescription drugs drives the consumer and drives the pharmacist dispensing to prescription. So all of these have prescription, have lost exclusivity, but they have the protection of brand equity. And brand equity can potentially last forever. We see switches like Benadryl that was switched in 1984 and 1986 for 2 different indications, and it's still a great drug. So that's the past. What are the opportunities in the future? We're looking here at a huge range of opportunities, each with regulatory and commercial challenges. I'm going to talk about issues this morning, and I have to say, I'm not going to tell you problems without solutions. And the other half of the talk that we're going to give from Everything Health today is going to be given later on this morning by Mary Alice Lawless, who's going to talk about some solutions to the issues that I mentioned. So it's not going to be a moaning session, it's going to be a session laying out the problems and laying out the solutions. And there's 2 sets of issues that happen with switches. The first set of issues is, how can we sell it? How can we commercialize this? How can we make money out of this? The second set is, how do we get it registered in the first place? Because every switch is an encounter with new issues. So looking at potential future switches, we've got migraine, we've got topical NSAIDs. Topical NSAIDs are a big category worldwide. Emergency contraception still has developments that can be made, also oral contraception. Erectile dysfunction came up yesterday as a category that is switching in other countries. And Joe Gitchell told me this morning he was behind somebody in the UK who asked for Viagra. Very quietly, can I? For some, sorry? For Viagra, yes. Whispered, can I have Viagra? Yes, fill in this questionnaire. So that's a switch going on, and we'll see how that goes. Cholesterol reduction. That's been a 20-year battle so far to get cholesterol reduction OTC, and we haven't made it yet, but we have a pathway, we believe. Overactive bladder was switched by shearing. It didn't work commercially, so it illustrates the fact that you have to switch in both regulatory and commercial terms. We've got other categories, all we sincerely believe are switchable. Blood pressure, some diabetes prevention, BPH, weight reduction, osteoporosis. They're all potential huge opportunities. But switch is not without issues. Now, a lot of people say to me, yeah, but the easy switches have been done. You know, the new stuff is a lot harder. Every switch, and I'm including historical switches here, is an encounter with new issues. Every switch has new issues to solve. And if you're leading a switch, and you're usually the commercial lead with a regulatory team and a medical team under you, you have to identify every conceivable issue at the very beginning, because if you don't, somebody else will. You also have to prepare sets of arguments for a very wide range of constituencies. And you can expect with the next generation of switches to have issues that have never before been addressed. So let's look at some of the past switches that were supposedly easy. Now, we've studied the issues for every switch historically, globally, and US. And you'll find this in the book on switch from Nicholas Hall and Company, available outside at a discount. I took 3 examples here. The first is Nicorette. I think in 1994, David Kessler was head of the FDA, said, "Over my dead body." So I guess we thought at the time, well, he didn't say no. But The company used experts, and Joe Gitchell's here so he could talk about this at coffee break. They used experts to prove it could not cause primary addiction. They communicated the population effect of the drug. What if millions of people take it? Because this had to address the fact that the success rate in this category was relatively low. It's not an antibiotic with 80% success rate, but still that has a huge contribution to public health. They had to address the idea that teenagers would abuse it. They had to address that with limited distribution and large packs. And they demonstrated abuse was very unlikely. There were a lot more issues. I'm just covering the highlights. But it was not an easy switch. Neither was Prilosec, who basically had to invent the indication of frequent heartburn to show that, yes, there are a lot of sufferers who have heartburn, which can be relieved with a short-term course, and we'll call that frequent heartburn. The consumer understands that, and it can be managed by Prilosec. They also had to manage the fact that it was a very slow-acting drug, and all the others on the market, like antacids and the H2s, act much faster. We had gynolotrimine, who had to prove to the authorities, Shearing at the time, that consumers who had the condition before could diagnose it again, and they could diagnose it as well as the doctors. And they even had to agree that first-time diagnosis was impossible and that the drug wouldn't be positioned on the label for first-time diagnosis. I've taken 3 studies here. I could have taken 3 J&J studies. They've done some fantastic switches. I'm sure Jerry McNally, if he's here, can tell you about those. But switches are challenging, and everyone who's done a significant first-in-class switch will tell you that it wasn't easy at the time, and don't expect the future ones to be easy, but they're possible. So one of the things that we're seeing is that with new switches, there are new issues, because one is compliance. If we're going for a condition that doesn't have symptoms, if you're going for a condition, I don't know, like lipid lowering, where you can take the drug for 3 or 4 weeks, you don't necessarily feel better. How do you know it's working? How do you know you need it in the first place? With some of our future switches that I've mentioned, drug interactions are complex. You cannot develop a label with 500 drugs on it and expect the consumer to work their way down it and say, no, 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 not on that, not on that, not on that. It's too complex. Will the switch have unintended consequences? Will the switch divert a population from medical care? Or will the switch bring a totally new population into medical care? These are huge questions. And switches generally must increase access to treatment. And you have to prove that. But each of these issues, and FDA are raising these issues with new switches, reflect an opportunity, a possibility of benefiting public health, if you can manage it. And some of the most recent switches that have gone to FDA have had issues of that are really nothing to do with the drug, where FDA says, what about in the target group you're going for undiagnosed CV disease? And you can say, well, that's nothing to do with the drug. And they say, yes, but it is an issue in the population you're trying to reach. Or what about a large population of undiagnosed diabetics? We're worried about those. Those are real public health problems in the country, which FDA is trying to address. And when they raise it with you, that seems like an issue, but it's also a challenge and a problem that we should think of addressing in consumer healthcare. These are big, big issues, and if we can address them, they are major opportunities for the business. So we need new and creative regulatory solutions. And the good news is that consumers are very comfortable with technology. I don't need to repeat any of the figures you saw yesterday about how buying online, having a profile, giving data to a system is so natural for consumers. They do much more, it's much more complicated to buy a travel on Expedia than to buy any possible future switch. And your profile is in there, and consumers are very, very comfortable in doing that. They have moved on to that in the last 10 years in a way that enables future switches to happen. What I've laid out here is some criteria for the successful future switch solutions. The first thing is they must be consumer-centric. It's very easy, you know, when you start out trying to switch a drug, you must think, how can I switch it, but also how can I sell it? You must have a compelling consumer offering. And if it's a category that already exists, your compelling consumer offering must have competitive advantages over anything that's already there. So it must be something that is a compelling consumer offering. It might also be something that's universal. We've seen many potential solutions for switch issues which are optional. There's pack insert leaflets, fold-outs, apps, videos the consumer can watch. I mean, these are possible, but they're optional. A switch solution for the next generation of drugs has to be something that the consumer has to go through in a compulsory way, but still a way that is natural to them, in the same way that ordering on Amazon might be natural, or ordering travel might be natural. The other thing is, the solution mustn't be possible to be gamed. In other words, a consumer can say, well, the right answer is, if the product's for somebody over 40, obviously the right answer is I'm over 40, so I'm over 40. If you can game the system, it's not going to work, because you will get some small level, but some that would worry FDA, some level of abuse. Most consumers follow the label correctly, but FDA is worried about the few that don't. The next benefit of a potential switch is that it can use data from the individual to put on their records. Imagine you switch cholesterol lowering and you bring another 10 million people into cholesterol treatment. The system would like to know that. Health plans would like to know who's on this product. They have scores, they have HEDIS scores that measure, you know, the health of their population. Employers would like to know if more of their population is under treatment, statistically. So it's very important also for the next time you go to the doctor that he doesn't prescribe you something you're already taking, OTC, by a different name, which the consumer doesn't recognize. So it's very important it goes into the medical records. And going into the medical records also contributes to public health information. If you can switch something and the data goes into the public health records, you can go back to FDA a year after a switch and say, we were right. We've brought another couple of million people into treatment, and we're going to measure this over time, and you're going to see the contribution that this big switch has made to public health. Wouldn't that be nice? And the last thing is that the solution, from a consumer point of view, must offer the consumer time value. There's a lot of friction in buying OTCs. If you stand in an OTC aisle, you know, the OTC aisle is the most confusing in the country, with the possible exception of life insurance, which, you know, I've never really understood. So if you stand in an OTC aisle in any store and you look reasonably intelligent, which you all do, somebody will come up to you and ask you a question. It's inevitable. You stand there, it's the 5-minute rule. Somebody in the next 5 minutes is going to come up to you. I tried it last Sunday. I was in Target, and I just stood in the OTC aisle, and an elderly man approached me, and he said, do you know where, he had a list. We said yesterday, all men have lists. Women go shopping in an exploratory way, but men go in with lists, and they think, God, what is arugula? You know, and so they're in the aisle, and an elderly man comes up to me, and he says, I'm looking for naproxen sodium. He said, no, I can't find the damn thing anywhere. Of course, the analgesic aisle is 100 yards long. But I was very easy to say, there it is right there in front of you. So, yes, it's very, very confusing. And confusion is friction. Confusion is time taken out of the consumer's day. Confusion, any barrier is a big barrier. And the biggest barrier in OTCs overall is confusion. So if you can solve the consumer's time value, you have taken them a big, big step forward. Now, as I said, a lot of what I've said so far has been problems. We are going to offer solutions. We are going to offer approaches that will take us forward. The other thing that has come up over the last day, and I will highlight it because it's integrated with this, is that fundamentally the consumer-centric business model, if it's truly going to be consumer-centric, has to evolve. Because where we are now with OTCs is somebody coming in and looking down an aisle that's 100 yards long, hundreds of SKUs, and looking for what they want, and it's very confusing. Our business is about making more and more pills at the moment. That's not a good business to be in if you can't add value to pills, because when I first went into consumer healthcare, private label had about a 30% share. Private label has grown and grown and grown, and part of that is that the companies have not been able to add value to their brands, not been able to add relevant value to their brands that can separate the private label, the brand from private label. You must have unique difference, or the consumer will go, as they are going, increasingly for value. The old model is mass media, increasingly fragmented. Is mass media becoming fragmented? Is the way people shop becoming fragmented? Yes, yes, and yes. Are shops changing? Yes. Will shops go away? Some will, some won't. Is the consumer shopping online? Yes. Every damn thing you can say about the future, the answer is yes. It's all changing in a way that we have to be prepared for. We're getting new types of store. We're getting stores are offering wellness offerings to bring consumers in, to make them loyal, to lock in, to give them value. But the business model is fundamentally transforming. Healthcare customers are very comfortable with technology, very comfortable, and we should use that to enable them to buy OTCs, to target them, and to enable them to buy the next generation of switch. Innovation in the future will not be about a new pill, it will be about innovating, creating, and dominating new market spaces. The value that we bring over and above the pill has to be consumer-centric. People don't want a pill for a headache, they want their headache to go away. They don't want a migraine pill, they want to be able to live free without migraine and not have it interrupt their lives. They don't want cholesterol lowering, they want to live longer. They want total solutions, and that means more than a pill. So non-prescription medicines will be increasingly integrated into the healthcare system as we move non-prescription medicines to chronic, non-communicable diseases. And this is good. This means that non-prescription medicines and switches have a big future, but it's going to be a different future. It's going to involve technology. It's going to involve different ways of selection, different ways of buying product. It's going to be different, and the old business models won't apply, and we have to be able to adapt to new business models. It'll be challenging in companies because it's very easy to go to management and do something that's been done before, where you've got a basis on it and you've shown concepts and you put it on the store and it's going to sell X. The new business models will be challenging because you'll be doing things that have never been done before, and forecasting won't be as easy as it used to be in the past. It's always involving some risk and some ability to communicate the opportunities and the uncertainties, but to say this is the way we must go. Now, as I said, this isn't a moan session or an outline of the problems. We're going to be covering some of the solutions later on. But I wanted to leave it there, and thank you for listening. I'd like to introduce now Vidhu Bansal Dev. Vidhu